disrupt God's kingdom.
Welcome to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis. Now here's your host, Andrew.
Sky to UFO Synopsis on UFO Paranormal Radio Network. Also broadcast live on the 105.5 New I'm your host, Andrew, and tonight my guest is Paul Stonehill. Paul Stonehill is an international author, lecturer, consultant, and broadcaster whose areas of interest and published work include UFOs and USOs, Soviet space program, Eurasian paranormal phenomenon, psi research, Soviet espionage, warfare, and mysteries of Russian and Ukrainian history. Paul's published books include The Soviet UFO Files, Paranormal Encounters Behind the Iron Curtain, Mysterious Skies, Soviet UFO Phenomenon, and most recently, UFO Case Files of Russia. Those last two books he co-authored with UK researcher Philip Mantell. His most recent book, UFO Case of Russia, is one that I'm almost done reading, and I find it a very fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. I've been hoping to get Mr. Stonehill on the Eye to the Sky program for some time now, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome him as my guest this evening. And welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much.
I was just curious, what got you started on paranormal in general, ufology, and the whole gamut?
I was interested as a child in the former Soviet Union, and I had plenty of information to look at. Even with all the Soviet ideology and related items, there were interesting publications, such as Technika Молодежи magazine, which was something like Omni magazine with UFO thematics as well, to an extent. Very, very brave publication, I should say. A number of Soviet cosmonauts, for example, revealed their views about UFOs on pages of the magazine. Plus, I met somebody who had been a witness to a UFO over the Soviet Arctic areas back in late 1930s. And one thing led to another, and I've been collecting information ever since, and I have maintained contacts any way possible with some of those people who had been involved in UFO field research in the former Soviet Union, even after I left the USSR.
Have you ever had a sighting of your own?
Yes, actually in the United States in 1989 Northridge, a fiery sphere, I recall. I don't remember the date, but it was myself and my wife that had observed it.
Oh, how neat. It's always exciting having a good, clear sighting of something that you can't explain. Your book, UFO Case Files of Russia, with your co-author, Philip Mantell, I guess as I'm not quite finished with it, I think what's slowing me up so much is the pronunciation of Russian names and place names, because to tell you honest truth, I've never really never really delved too much into Russian language. But there are some very interesting people that you talk about in this book, different researchers that oh gosh, back in the 20s and the 30s studying this subject.
And besides, it's not even so much, it's not only Russia, I would say Eurasia, to the point that China, Mongolia, Arctic areas around the Soviet Union and Europe, other areas are not well known to American and West European readers, but I think people should know much more, because so much has been happening in those areas, in the deserts of Mongolia, in the ice deserts of the Arctic areas, sightings. and sightings observed by trained people, military, Navy personnel, submarine officers, those who had to see and record. This was their duty and their job. As for Russia itself and people who are of noticed that if I look at the overall picture, not only at the exciting insights of the Soviet research, if you look at the overall information, you start seeing people that are very hard to explain. Their knowledge stands out from. It's like they're superhuman to an extent of what they knew. For example, Professor Ivan Yefremov, who was a Soviet science fiction writer, but much more than that. He was a scientist, a discoverer, and he possessed so much knowledge and information. And although he was a Soviet patriot and somebody who believed in communism of a different nature than what we had in the Soviet Union, he was so dangerous to the state that after he died, the KGB raided his apartment, confiscated his belongings, and we still don't know what they took. And his case was combined in 40 volumes that people don't have access to, of course, till today, although he died in 1972. But this was a great person, somebody who stood out from the bounds of time and space according to his American acquaintance, a professor in UCLA. That's just one, but there was another example I want to give you is somebody who pushed for Soviet military and civilian researchers to work together in unison, so to say, to promote UFO research, something that we don't have even close comparison to in the United States. But this happened in 1967 when Soviet scientists, UFO enthusiasts, and a number of military people, high-ranking people, joined hands and were able to appeal to the Soviet populace through television, asking for information about UFOs, and they received a flood of materials. And they were shut down 1 month after that. One of the people who was responsible for this event was a very mysterious personality, and I could not get to my research much about him. He was allegedly an Estonian by birth, General Reino, who participated in World War II, and after he was involved with Soviet Air Force, and he was the one who pushed for the creation, for example, of this commission. Very unusual fact. Very little is known about this personality, where he came from, what he was, but he was instrumental. That's just two people that I found out. It's just some of the facts that come out when after years of research. If you look at the history of Soviet UFO research from the sideline, so to say, or you start seeing patterns that basically are earth-shattering. For example, whenever the Soviet Union and the United States work together closely to solve, let's say, UFO phenomenon, something happened that would tear us apart. And this is, to me, it's immensely interesting. For example, late 1970s, during the détente era, when we came very close together, we had the invasion of Afghanistan from the Soviet Union, which nobody still can explain why it happened and why it even took place, because that was a friendly ally country to the Soviet Union. And yet, because of that, we started getting into very cold regions of the Cold War, so to say. And there were other instances. Let's say late 1980s now, when the Soviet Union, 10 years later, when the Soviet Union was going through changes and the United States was very much a friendly power to it, we had the Phobos mission to Mars, to the moonlet of Mars, which was very important apparently to the United States, because our country was very much involved with the Soviet project and the West Europeans as well. Well, we know that one of the space probes was destroyed or lost on the way to Mars. The other one was destroyed. And from my information, I knew that JPL was very much interested and basically knew what was going on, as well as others. Again, this was the time of the United States and the Soviet Union working closely together, and then the sudden disintegration of the Soviet Union and chaos that followed. Again, the countries were torn apart. What's happening now with, for example, the Phobos mission, China and Russia are going back to Mars. Next year, there will be another mission, and they seem to be in great haste to get there. Well, based on my books, and it's in my book and writings, and some of the information I've been sending out, they, as well as the United States, know that there is an artificial structure, something on the surface of Phobos, and they are in a great hurry to get there. So, and even, nowadays when you start seeing news like NASA trying to send, a mission of no return to Mars, it just confirms that there is a lot that's going on. And the roots of it I could see going back to late 1940s, maybe even before that. We just don't have enough information. But general interest from the Soviet state to the UFO phenomenon and related phenomenon, fear and confusion, no less than in the United States, trying to understand whether UFOs present danger to the Soviet Union, a program, an unprecedented program that the Soviets had created back in 1978 and which existed for 13 years, an official state program to study UFOs, a combined academic/military research, in which academics were not as agile or eager to study this phenomenon, at least some of them, as the military people were. The progressive role of the Russian Navy in studying UFO, I don't want to say Russian, I should say Soviet, because it combined representatives from all over the USSR, where the Soviet Navy was instrumental in studying UFOs and gave refuge and great work to, for example, Vladimir Zhazha, who was one of the most active UFO researchers at that time in the Soviet Union, and he was punished for his outspokenness by, some small-time petty ideologists from Communist Party. So he would lose his job and ability to lecture on one hand, but on another hand, his friends from the Soviet Navy, from the top echelons of the Navy, would give him the best job in the world to write about USOs, unidentified submersible objects, something that I've been studying quite a lot and writing quite a lot about. So it's maybe a picture of confusion, but some structures come out as you look again at the whole picture. And the Soviets, yes, they had been quite amazed by what's happening around them, just like us. But then, as information comes out from the former Soviet Union, less now, of course, than before, you start seeing, like I said, some identifiable structures. And as time goes by, we find out, for example, that based on the information now that Russians have to look back at Soviet archives, not available to us. They, for example, come up with conclusions that the United States actually, during Cold War, were practicing not to fight off the Soviet danger or threat, but extraterrestrial threat. I mean, when you hear news information like that, you start thinking, what was going on? What is it that we know? And I've always used a metaphor that there used to be a giant mirror. Once it reflected the truth about ET civilizations or UFO phenomenon, but it was smashed And all we have now are just small fragments that we're trying to piece together. So the books that I've written with Philip are just a way to put some fragments together, but as the picture becomes more completed, I should say, it's becoming more fascinating.
Oh, well, and another aspect of the book that really fascinated me is that you didn't start the book in the modern era. You tell of some unusual stories from, way back in like the 1100s, and sometimes some of them even further back than that, I think.
Absolutely.
And it was amazing. Russian events were things that you never really heard of here in the States until after the breakup of the former Soviet Union. Can you tell us a couple of the stories of the distant past?
Well, I will, but I also want to mention that I've been doing my research on, and I have in my presentations, I show icons from ancient Russia and countries like Georgia, a proud small country on the Black Sea coast, one of the first civilized nations in the world. They have great icons where you can clearly see UFOs in religious art, and similar. Armenia, for example, too, they have great UFO in ancient history. But I'll tell you a small story that I believe from Kiev, from my place of birth, which took place I believe in the 10th century. There was a star-like object came, blood-stained, a star with bloody rays, something like that, came over Kiev and stayed for a while in the sky, and people are afraid, of course, and they prayed and so forth. And then one day, a very ugly baby was cast down and found in the river. Non-existent now, but there was a river in the area. And when the fishermen take a look at it, they were in horror and shame, and they they put it back to die in the river, And the description was very much of like aliens are described today, and the star was still in the sky. Another well-known case that I always mentioned and will is the 10th century case of an Arab diplomat from Baghdad Caliphate who came to the areas of modern Russia in the Volga region, and he had been shown the very strange phenomenon of UFOs battle in the sky among two different groups of UFOs, and this took place not just once, but more than that. And his companions were very much afraid and they knelt down to pray, and local people laughed and said, what are you afraid of? We see them basically on a daily basis. Now this was Ibn Fadlan, very interesting personality. We had a movie about, I would say 20 years ago, about 12, maybe 15 years ago. Antonio Banderas played him. It was called The 13th Warrior. Well, Antonio played this very gentleman who traveled to Russia and left a great manuscript. I have it. It took me a while to find it, but I have it in Russian about his experiences. And there were many more. There was a case of from the 17th century. We know quite a lot about it because a very conscientious person wrote down all the details. It took place by a small lake, by a well-known monastery in Russia, and an object kept coming back more than once to the site of the lake, and people, of course, were afraid and prayed and so forth. But that object was very much a UFO in our modern description, very similar to what we see, with something like floodlights, and it even had it had biological effect on the lake and the fish and the people who had observed it. Very interesting. But as I continue research, I find out that that area itself is a very anomalous area as is, and there were cases of UFOs being observed during the, over the battle scenes, very important in Russian history. And observers at the time would depict them in their religious art, which is very interesting. I mean, where would they come up with an idea of an UFO-like object in the sky? But they did, and that just from the ancient times. And in my book, I always mention the not a case of such long ago, but still one of the most important ones is the Tunguska or Tunguska case of 1908, when a giant object came to the atmosphere, into the atmosphere of our planet over Siberia, and was most likely shot down by another object that was shot from the surface of our planet to stop it. And this is what happened in 1908, at least according to one theory. But we present all theories about it. And I urge people to pay attention to what happened to Tunguska and try to find out more and more. We've tried to lay down the case for it and at least give tools to others who want to study it. I think in itself it might have been one of the most important cases of the 20th century. And believe me, still there are scientists and researchers who go back to the remote, godforsaken area in Siberia trying to find answers.
Well, that kind of leads into our first question from our virtual auditorium, this one from Loonster. And he would like to know if you think that the object that exploded over Tunguska was a UFO or something else.
It was a UFO, if we adhere to the strict understanding of the word, or a spaceship from another civilization, or I believe it was an invader, an invading object that whatever sentinel we have on the face of our planet, whatever structure or whatever entity there exists that knows of an imminent danger coming to this, and threatening our civilization. Apparently, this was the case, if we accept one of the theories that exists, and it was shot down. It wasn't just an implosion. Of course, it was no comet or meteorite or anything like that. But apparently, as time goes by, the more research we get, the more I'm convinced that it was a threatening object that came into the atmosphere of our planet and was taken care of by whatever we have here to protect us.
Interesting. I'd never considered it that way. I really hadn't. Another one that you write about, you and Philip wrote about in this book, and again, I apologize because I'm not even going to try and pronounce these names because I'll just mangle them. But I had heard about this one quite a while ago. It was about the object that crashed and burned on a mountainside.
The Dalnegorsk.
Yes.
The Dalnegorsk, here's what's interesting about this case. Most likely it was a satellite, a spy satellite that was being tested or just did not go where it was supposed to go and crashed and burned. Whatever technology was later collected, whatever from the fragments. Some Soviet UFO researchers and scientists proved that we have similar technologies, even during the Soviet times. It's very high tech, very advanced, but nothing related to anything that's unusual. However, 1 year later, a group of UFOs came to the area. Maybe it was a coincidence, but to the very area in the Far East, and they were recorded and registered and observed by very serious people basically from regular citizens of the Soviet Union on, up to military scientists. And there was a whole slew of them. And they came over, and some of them even came to Dalmagorsk. So that's a very interesting case. I personally believe it was a satellite that exploded. It contained very up-to-date technology that they had been testing, but what happened afterwards still cannot be explained. And to be honest, I don't know how many people are still looking. There is no, per se, there are UFO organizations in the Soviet Union and former Soviet Union, Russia. There are very active people, but they are limited. Of course, funds, abilities to study such information. So whatever further research we have is, I'm very thankful to people like Mikhail Gerstein or Vladimir Uvarov to an extent, and Vadim Chernobrov and others who at least are trying to piece together UFO history of their country.
Well, excuse me. Something I've been dying to ask you ever since I first saw it aired on television here, and I have a copy of it on VHS. The documentary special that was aired, I believe it was on Fox, but don't quote me, I could be wrong, that was hosted by Roger Moore. I think it was the KGB UFO file.
Yes.
What's the name of it? In this, they had footage of what appeared to be a crashed disc with Russian soldiers and officers around it. Was this ever proven to be fact or fake?
Yes, they actually a number of people in the former Soviet Union were trying their best to prove that it was a fake. What's interesting is that the producers of that film, they had, I personally had seen how many materials from the former Soviet Union they had in their possession, and I think they wanted to make more, as specials and so forth. I think it has not materialized. But again, a number of important people in Russia say it was a fake. Some people say it might have been a training film. So it's still a very an inconclusive case. I have not heard since or before of some of the researchers that they had presented in that film. So I want to leave it up to Russian UFO researchers to finalize, because some of them, like I said, are completely convinced that it was a fake. Some of them, at least I think one was not so sure. So I will leave it alone, and that's what I think in the preface to our book we say that if we don't have complete information, we don't want to get into this.
Oh, interesting. From what they were showing on the documentary, the sticker on the film canister itself looked authentic. The uniforms and everything looked authentic. I was like on the fence, because it's so easy to fake stuff like that. Because this came out not long after the so-called autopsy video, and that has been proven to be fake. But this, it looks so authentic. I mean, everything just looked right.
I think you should find, and whoever questions it, I think they have to find producers of this film, because, like I said, I've seen they had a lot of information, they had a lot of files and films. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but they've been silent after that. They would be the best people to ask about this case and about their contacts in the Soviet Union. I present information, and Philip has excellent sources that we get from the Soviet Union, and we try from the former Soviet Union, and we also try to filter as much as possible, and when to the extent if something is a hoax, or if we're given information, we verify with people like, for example, Mikhail Gerstein or Vadim Chernobrov, and on occasions we find out if something is a hoax or other sources we use, or if something is misrepresented, and this information I put out, it doesn't make me very popular sometimes. For example, I would say not that long ago, there was a film about some strange UFOs over Russia, and I verified that they were so-called Chinese lanterns, and that's all it was. People want to believe something is wonderful happening in front of our eyes, and a representation of ET civilization. But for the most part, we have to be very careful. I would say 98% of what we see in the sky and take out to be UFOs are just what should I say, a representation of our technology or military tests or related phenomena.
Well, another one that's had a lot of talk lately is the one that everybody refers to as the Russian spiral. Now, if they just do their homework, they would find that, hey, that wasn't, some UFO. It was a rocket test that went awry.
Bulava, yes. But people want to believe in something, and I can quite understand it. But and this was the task that Soviet military, for example, had to deal with, how to discern between fake UFOs or just unknown phenomenon and real UFOs, and whether they represent danger to the Soviet state. And they had quite a lot to deal with, and they had observed quite a lot. And then you had the KGB who were not at all interested per se in UFOs. They were more interested in shutting down UFO researchers who had seen more than they had to, or were authorized to. But because there were so many informers in the Soviet Union, 75 years of communism, you had instilled too much fear in the Soviet population. And if they had seen something unusual, some people would immediately run to the KGB and say, well, this is what I see, we have to report it. And the KGB had to collect such information. So they also wanted, to an extent, to understand what is going on. For example, the KGB department that dealt with UFOs was, I believe it was the 10th section of the first directorate. They had to protect Soviet secret facilities and scientific facilities that were conducting special experiments. And of course, if you see an unusual object over a Soviet, top secret UFO, top secret military site, you had to deal with this. And they did, and they studied, and they found out that, yes, there is a presence out there. It's not the Americans, they knew it. The Chinese were not as advanced at the time. So what is it that hovers over our facilities? Sometimes Soviets made very, very costly mistakes trying to shoot down UFOs, and they paid with aircraft and human lives for that. Sometimes they tried to capture whatever unusual phenomena they would find in their waters, like in Lake Baikal, and people would get lost. So they learned their lessons, and information was collected. But, of course, the most secret information we'll probably never see, but enough had leaked out to present a tremendous picture, again, of UFO presence, confusion, fear, and inability to deal with this in a, comprehensive manner, and just indifference.
In your book, you mentioned that after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the breakup, take your pick, there were old KGB files were turning up on the black market, so to speak, but there are so many that nobody really knows exactly where to look for them anymore. Because the administration's just not there anymore.
The most important transfer of files, as far as we know, took place in early 1990s, and it happened because of the efforts of a very interesting and yet another mysterious personality in the field of Soviet UFO research, a Ukrainian cosmonaut, Pavel Popovich, who was more than just a mere cosmonaut. I mean, he could be the happy child of the state and, cherish his rewards, but instead he did his best to help UFO researchers. He was active in a Soviet and an offshoot of a Soviet program to study UFOs in early 1980s, and he provided protection to Vladimir Zhazha and his group of UFO researchers, and did his best to enhance such research. Now, he was the one that basically obtained 124 pages of the blue file, the so-called KGB materials on UFOs. A tremendous amount of information. It's in the book too, and we use it as a reference on and on, because if you start researching cases in there, and you find patterns with other cases that took place, it's amazing. But as others in the former Soviet Union are sure, some of the most interesting information has been kept and will not be available. Black market, some information leaks out. I think we mentioned one case when somebody was trying to sell files. I honestly think that the most interesting cases are not available to us. Simple real UFO researchers, I'm sure they may be available to the United States or other world governments at the very top. They have to exchange such information, and I can only guess and surmise what's in there. But I'm not in despair, because just the information we have presents a tremendous picture. I stand in awe of what I see. I mean, reports from cosmonauts who are more outspoken than their American counterparts, Soviet cosmonauts, Navy, Soviet and Russian Navy. They had a tremendous challenge in meeting, deadlines in front of them to trying to solve the cases of USOs they had met while surfing, so to say, oceans of our planet and their secret missions. And there's a lot, and it's available. Putting it together is a pleasure, because you do see how serious this phenomenon is.
It's interesting that you should bring up cosmonauts, because we have a question from our virtual auditorium on just that subject. This again is from Munster, and he asks, who's the most famous cosmonaut that has seen the most UFOs while in space?
Well, I would say Vladimir Kovalyonok and Savinych, and we mentioned their fifth expedition and other cases in the book. We have a whole chapter in our book about it. But I would also say that Georgy Grechko, is a very interesting personality, and he's one of the first cosmonauts, and he would admit seeing something in space, and some of his observations are very important to me in my research of Professor Yefremov's information. But then he would say, no, I don't believe in UFOs. But then he added that he believes in UFOs after he had seen a painting in England that is from the Middle Ages, actually. And I have that painting, an image of that painting in my files. And you clearly see a very advanced UFO in that painting. But he had seen a lot. So to answer your question, I would say, I would definitely say that the first two cosmonauts, but Pavel Popovich is also one who had been involved. If he had not seen, he had one sighting, and this was actually on his way to the United States over Cuba. He and other Soviet scientists aboard an airplane in 1978. He was on his way, I believe, to Baltimore. Very interesting, unusual sighting. But Pavel Popovich knew quite a lot, and he expressed himself. He wasn't afraid. There were others I mentioned in the book, and even today, modern Russian cosmonauts, I think one or two were quite outspoken.
That's interesting that they would be that outspoken, because there's only been, 2 or 3 American astronauts that have even dared mention anything.
This is very interesting to me. It's like I said, in some ways it cannot be black and white. I mean, let me explain. I am from Ukraine, and I don't like what had been done to my country and other countries in the Soviet Union by those who, took away power, who took control over our country in 1917, and what they did and how many people they killed and the bloody communist ideology. I don't like what they had been doing. And in any way I could, I resisted them, even when living in the Soviet Union. But politics aside, ideology aside, and you've read my book, you see that I don't go too much into that, because people have different experiences. But you start seeing things that are different from just the perspective of let's say, regular observer. For example, like I said, in the United States we live in a democracy, but I've never seen an example of military and civilian researchers joining hands together and getting on to television to speak to the people, let's say, of the United States, of the need to study UFOs and to send information about UFO experiences to such and such address in Washington. Can you imagine if this happened tomorrow? If, Joint Chiefs of Staff and, let's say, MUFON or some other organization, appealing to the people of the United States on some TV network, saying that this is a very serious phenomenon and we need your help. Can you imagine the outpouring of information, it hasn't happened here, but it happened in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, let's say, not because of him, but, in the darkest hours, let's say, of what we call mature socialism. It happened. And, again, the Soviet army, in many ways, the Soviet armed forces were quite active in pursuing, UFO research and helped UFO researchers. So it's like Alice in Wonderland. This is what's happening. I'm not even speaking about China, who is completely different from the former Soviet Union, modern Russia, and modern United States in their approach to UFO phenomenon. I strongly recommend that people keep an eye on what's going on in China. They have state-sponsored UFO organizations, I believe, and hundreds of thousands of people involved. There is not even a doubt in their mind that UFOs exist. There is no media that, puts down UFO researchers or makes fun of them. No, they're very serious, and they want to solve this problem, or they want to find out what's happening. So that's what I wanted to let you know, that, in the Soviet Union, no matter politics aside, it was interesting to see how UFO phenomenon had been handled. On one hand, you had ideologists, and to an extent KGB, who would say UFOs don't exist, and as proof, they would publish books by American debunkers, as an example, which was amazing. They would utilize Americans to put down interest in UFOs. You couldn't say UFO, NLO in Russian, abbreviation, for a number of years. I mean, you could say it, but you could not publish articles because of censorship about it. Yet some people tried and were able to publish information about, they would call it unusual aerial phenomena, like in the magazine that I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, Техника молодежи. And this was a great, and still is, a very interesting publication, because some of the cosmonauts who had opinions about objects they had seen out there in outer space, they would be able to write about it on pages of such magazines. I don't recall American astronauts writing about UFO experiences on pages of Discovery magazine or Popular Mechanics.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny that one of the debunkers that they picked was James Olberg. I mean, I have no use for the individual myself, but, you know, I just find a lot of his explanations are rather laughable. We have another question from our virtual auditorium, and this one's from Gossamer, and he asks, after the fall of communism, did any of the countries that were formerly under Soviet control become more open with UFO incident data from these countries?
Ukraine definitely, and not because I'm from Ukraine, but I have to tell you that they had continued for a number of years UFO research based on the same instructions, so-called instructions issued to the Soviet armed forces. And of course they don't have a lot of funds and a lot of time to do it, but they were the ones that tried to study UFOs. But I want to let you know something. Russia is a very powerful state today too, and they have their interest in keeping UFO information, let's say, close to their heart. There was a case about 10 years ago, interesting development. Ukraine owed Russia quite a lot of money for natural gas, and in exchange for this, for lessening this debt or forgiveness, Russia asked that Ukraine transfer to it files of the Strategic Air Force of the Soviet Union, which Ukraine inherited when the Soviet Union broke apart. And those files, as far as Ukrainian UFO researchers knew, contained a lot of first-rate UFO observation information and cases. And Russia, as far as we know, was able to get their files, not there, but Soviet files from Ukraine. So while, you know, there may be other countries interested in UFO research, it's not their immediate concern. Just basic survival is. But within Russia itself, you had interesting developments. Even, you know, statements of Kirsan Ilyumzhinov, who was the former president of Kalmykia, a Russian politician who claimed to have been abducted by UFOs in 1997. Very interesting personality, and a few other cases. So Ukraine it would be the country.
Interesting, very interesting. And I have to go into this next question from our virtual auditorium because I already know part of the answer because I read this section in the book on it. This is from Dimensional Star, and she says, I do not recall the name of the community. I believe it is near the foothills of the Ural Mountains. There are stories of many unusual events as if it is a high degree of strangeness area. Are there areas in Russia where there is a higher concentration of activity as opposed to others?
Absolutely. The Ural Mountains, I think I know what you're talking about, the Malepka village, and it's a very controversial area in itself. But I need to stress, definitely. And most of the areas that have high concentration of UFOs are far removed areas, and only, you know, Navy personnel, Russian armed forces and scientists see quite a lot of activity. And one day when Philip and I finish the book about USOs, people will be able to see, more of such areas. But there is enough information in UFO files, case files of Russia, to identify such areas, and we actually went chapter by chapter. But I would say the Ural Mountains, a tremendously important paranormal area for thousands of years, not only hundreds, including ancient astronaut hypotheses and findings in the area that we have that have been discovered, such as Arkaim and a few others. Eastern Siberia, Yakutia, especially areas around the Russian maritime province. The Arctic areas, I stress because we've been finding more information, including Nazi Germany's interest in that area and expeditions to the Soviet Arctic under the nose of the Soviets. They knew there were things to see. Also, areas near Mongolia, the Russian-Iranian border, very important. Areas in Central Asia. Now, in the former Soviet Union, there are, of course, free countries now, but still, very, very interesting areas. In the European parts of Russia, I would stress areas around Voronezh, especially Borisogledsk airfield, testing ground areas and so forth, where we had UFO interference with Soviet aircraft and basically, desperate Soviet commanders who were trying to find out what's going on and why their aircraft was being destroyed. Let me see if I had forgotten anything else. Oh, yes, the areas around Finland, St. Petersburg, that general Karelia, that general area, lakes, and not to forget Lake Baikal as well. And to the extent that not long ago, Vladimir Putin himself went to the bottom of Lake Baikal with a number of scientists. And I guess I know what they were looking for. So those are just most of the areas, basically, of unusual UFO activity in the former Soviet Union.
In that section, I was reading that and was just blown away by the quality as well as the quantity of the reports that you found. And I was just amazed. It was a really good section in the book.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Let's see, we've got about 2 minutes before we go to break. If you'd like to let people know where they can locate your book, or in a website if you have.
Heartsofatlantis.com, or even the Amazon. It's called UFO Case Files of Russia, and my first book was, I don't know if it's still out there, but it was called the Soviet UFO Files back in 1998, but the most updated, I guess, would be the UFO Case Files of Russia.
And it is a good book. Like I said, I'm not quite done with it. It didn't arrive in time for me to get finished, but I promise I will. It is that interesting.
Thank you.
There is so much information packed in this book, along with a few photographs, and it's just amazing. There's so much information packed into this book that it's a lot to take in all at once, and that got me quite impressed. And I think we're close enough that we can go ahead and go to break now. So if you'll stay tuned here to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, and we'll be back in 8 to 9 minutes with Paul Stonehill.
Welcome to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis. Now here's your host, DeAndrew.
And welcome back to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis, here on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, also broadcast live on UPRN 105.5 New Orleans. I'm your host, DeAndrew, and tonight we've been talking with Paul Stonehill. But before we get back to Paul, I want to tell my husband, David, thank you very much, love, for the wonderful anniversary yesterday. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks again, love. And Paul, like we were saying at the break, we've got a few questions here that are backing up from our virtual auditorium, and I want to get those out of the way real quick so that we can get into the subject of USOs. This first question is from Loonster, and he asks, what's a good UFO hotspot in Russia to go skywatch?
I would say Vladivostok. That's in the far east of Russia. That's one. Definitely there's been a lot of activities. But Ural Mountains is another great area to go to. And I would suggest areas around northern Urals and southern Ural Mountains. You can see quite a lot there.
Okay, and our next question comes from Dimensional Star, and she asks, did Russia have areas where ICBMs are located that experienced UFO activity that took their weapons offline?
Absolutely. Actually, something else happened. It's in the book, but I've been talking about it too in Ukraine, where I'm from, 1982 case. You see, in the Soviet Union, as I mentioned before, they had a special program, a secret program, for UFO research. They didn't say UFO, but that's what they had been studying. And they had mobile field operational teams that they had sent to the areas of extreme danger. And extreme danger took place in early October of 1982, when for 15 seconds a missile silo that had ICBMs experienced loss of control, and the launch sequence was started. Moscow was impotent to do anything. Everybody was. And it seemed like the ICBMs were about to fly towards the United States. Why? Because a huge disc-like UFO appeared over this area. So when everything calmed down, thank God there was no launch of the ICBM at the time. A special team was sent from Moscow to study the situation. I think even here an ABC special had shown that case many years ago.
Okay, and now to a subject I've been finding very fascinating, USOs. I've heard a lot of USO stories from here in the States and Japan, but you don't hear much of anything from any other countries that are a coastal country. So it would be interesting to find out what you found of Russian USO sightings.
We present cases in the book. We have presented cases from Russian observations inside their lakes, deep water lakes, oceans, because they would carry on different missions, including espionage missions in different parts of our planet, and inside Soviet territorial waters. So when you say Japan, for example, there have been quite many cases in the Okhotsk, Sea of Okhotsk, or Arctic seas of the Soviet Union, quite a lot, including, for example, an observation they had in 1979 of a huge object over the ocean, a gigantic cylindrical object that separated the smaller objects who would fly away, which corresponded to the case we present in the book of 1953, observation over Siberia, Erie case. Also, observations of Soviet submarine officers of unusual objects that would travel at great speeds, in deep waters of the ocean. Concrete examples: the Soviets had a special research team, actually a few teams, that was put together by their top Navy commanders to study the so-called quackery phenomenon. Quacket means to emit sounds like frogs do, and that's what they dubbed, that's what they named strange phenomena they would encounter in the different oceans, but especially in the Atlantic, not too far from the United States, of strange, gigantic beings trying to follow them and maybe to an extent to communicate with Soviet underwater craft, and they were very concerned. They thought it was an American invention, but they found out it wasn't Americans tracking their submarines. Actually, Americans were quite amazed to find out it wasn't the Soviets when they had a meeting in late 1980s, from what we know. So those were very interesting cases. That phenomenon had been studied by brilliant military scientists for a number of years, but then it was suddenly shut down in 1985. The research was, and we don't know what happened to the files, where they had been transferred to, but this was a phenomenon they had studied. Also, a very interesting case in some of the in an island not too far away from the Falklands, British territory, the South Georgia Island. They had observed quite interesting UFOs over the island, donut-shaped, gigantic objects and such. In the book, we present information about cylindrical, cigar-shaped and other types of UFOs that would, or USOs that would exit and enter waters not far from Soviet submarines. There was an interesting case, I believe, in 1988 when when a powerful Soviet ship, Novorossiysk, lost all of its power when a UFO or USO would just exit the waters next to it. And I would say, I don't want to say dozens of cases, I would say hundreds of cases from all over the world, including, like in the Arctic Ocean, when a UFO would break through the ice and ascend, just go up into the skies in front of the eyes of Soviet military officers or naval officers. And of course, Vladimir Azhazha, whom I mentioned in his dealings with the Russian Navy, Soviet Navy, he had been shown information that was incredible and met with counterintelligence officers of the Russian Navy who told him of their experiences. So one of the most fascinating cases that people all over the world have read, that I was doing research on, and then Philip also joined in, was the case, again, 1982, remember that year, because so many interesting cases took place that year. You had the almost launch of the ICBMs in Ukraine, while at the same time in Siberia, in the Lake Baikal, where there was an attempt to capture the so-called swimmers, gigantic beings, I think like 9 feet tall, who were operating in the waters of Lake Baikal without any need to have anything like aqualungs or any breathing apparatuses. And when the Soviets, who were doing their training, found them, they made a very wrong decision to capture them, and lost a number of lives in the process. Then I have confirmation of such beings in other places, at least in Russia. Very unusual phenomenon in itself, but something that we should look at. And I'm sure there are entities in our planet who are studying them. I'm sure the United States is aware of it. But after my article had been translated in a number of languages, including Portuguese and others, I had been receiving other not information, but at least outpouring of information of reports from people from all over the world. This is very interesting, and I have to tell you that the Soviet Navy and Russian Navy before and now Russian Navy is a very interesting and very serious institution. When they study something, they put their best minds to it, and they had a number of cases to ponder about, including the 1976 case, for example, of a Soviet submarine base in the area, in the North Seas, that was approached by, I believe it was 9 dancing UFOs over that shut down all communications with the, with the main base, and were doing whatever they wanted around Soviet ship. This was a very interesting phenomenon and very disturbing to them. That's why they involved Mr. Ajaja in their research and a few others. That's just one. Also, cases of, I already mentioned gigantic submarines, but there were cases when such submarines were trying to enter Soviet waters, like in 1951, and Soviets did their best to stop them, but were not always successful. And you see quite a lot about it in all over the world, but especially in the Soviet Union. I was amazed to the extent that their Navy personnel had been recording such cases.
I was just curious. What is to you? What is your the USO cases that you've looked into? Which one really stuck with you? Which one do you find the most fascinating?
What's interesting to me is the cases in the Black Sea area. I've been to the Black Sea many years ago. I know how mysterious that area is. I think even not that long ago, one of the top American scientists discovered a remnants of an ancient civilization in the area, of pre-deluge civilization. I know a little bit more about the Black Sea, and I'm doing some other research. What gets to me is how many cases have been cited there, and but the most important one is one that was reported by late Kuzovkin. He was one of the top and active Russian UFO researchers, whose fate was not a happy one at the end. He reported how scientists, he told us how scientists who went down to the bottom of the Black Sea, so to say, observed a giant wheel about the size of a 10-story building. It was a structure, an unusual structure, artificial structure, but it was in the shape of a wheel that was turning around, and they were very close to it. This is one. This case, and the one that I mentioned before, the gigantic cylindrical object that separated into smaller objects over the Pacific Ocean. This was reported by at the time the Soviet Pacific Fleet Intelligence. No nonsense people.
Wow.
And, but those two I would say. But there is much. There are so many more cases. And again, when you start looking, you start seeing patterns, and hopefully somebody, people from other countries, like I know Argentina has their researchers, Brazil and others, will start comparing Russian cases to their own cases and see how many coincidences or not we have in common.
Interesting. All I know about USOs, I've seen from documentaries and a book on Shag Harbor, but gosh, you don't really hear that much about them. Before we go on, I'd like to try and get all questions that are sent in to me asked when I can. Here's a question from New York Lily, and she asks, did any of the remote viewers in Russia remote view any UFOs? And if they did, what did they find?
Remote viewers are, during the Soviet times, were, let's say, an asset of the Soviet state. So whatever, if they had been used by KGB operatives or information, we don't know that much. So I don't want to get psi research, so, remote viewing, that's a separate area, a fascinating area in itself. But I don't have enough information about their UFO-related research. I know quite a lot from available information about other psi research that took place in the Soviet Union, but not the UFO part of it, simply because there has not been enough credible information out there. And I don't want to tell you something that I cannot confirm by facts or at least evidence from my colleagues in Russia.
That's very understandable. Well, again, when the Soviet Union broke up, some files went this way, some files went that way, and nobody really knows where they all wound up.
I'll give you an example of the Roswell files. Again, Pavel Popovich. I'm proud of him because he's my, we both come from the same country, but he was very active. And I know that in 1993 he appealed to the Russia, the new Russia, Ministry of Interior to let him know what happened to the Roswell files that they had, based on the information about Stalin's interest and possessions and so forth. And the response he has that we don't have those files. They didn't say we never had them. They just responded, we do not have such files. So I'm interested where they transferred or shared with the United States. Could be. I believe so. I definitely think there is a high-level joint exchange of information. It has to be based on the, based just on the wealth of information out there, and that's just available to researchers like me, like Phip, like a few others, those who take time to study it. I am sure people at the top have to know what we know and much more, and they must do something to be ready to see the challenges presented by UFO phenomenon, because it's not going away. So I think, in my opinion, there has to be, just like in the areas of security, of exchange of security information, has to be exchange of UFO-related information, and still, no matter how further apart we are thrown sometimes by events of history, like late 1970s, I still think there is joint cooperation and research, not just exchange of information, if I can jump into this area. And to me, the mission next year of China and Russia to Phobos is proof of this. I know India will get an effort too, and I hope the United States will be joining with them. But I am sure that this will happen. I'll give you another quick example. There's a lot of talk in the United States that U.S. missions to the moon never took place, and all this is a hoax. Well, Russian cosmonauts such as Leonov say, no, this is not true. We had observed Americans on the moon. We're not kids. We know what we had seen. So definitely there was, it's not that somebody invented like Hollywood. It did take place. Americans did go to the moon. And they say it without any hesitation. So I think there's been espionage, the U.S. spying on the Soviet Union and vice versa, of course, and there has been cooperation, and still goes on.
Well, gosh, when I was a kid in high school, I remember the Apollo-Soyuz missions. There was cooperation there as well. But this is an aspect I had never really considered, was that the reason why a lot of these files can't be found is because they're not even in the country anymore, that they're in the U.S. That's just not something I had even thought of.
Gee, well, you remember the Apollo-Soyuz? I remember, and this was at the time when détente was, and everybody was hopeful. not naive, but at least hopeful, even us, people who escaped from the Soviet Union, well, let's see what's going to happen. Countries joining together, at least making an effort, joint space missions, and then 1979, and then the end of détente, and again, it's like somebody is trying to separate countries that want to join together, nations that want to join together, and do something. And then this, like I said, it was like an explosion in a way when we received this information about a top Russian scientist from the Institute of United States and Canada. This is one of their most serious institutions. They study, they make policies based on their findings. Well, one of their top scientists comes out and says last year this year, there was never a Cold War. The United States actually was testing itself or getting prepared for an alien invasion, and the Soviet Union was the entity that they would train on, and vice versa, of course. I mean, even if he didn't say that, I can relate to this. So much more has been happening than we know or can see. Of course, there's no way that this information can remain hidden. All of this information. I'm sure those who need to are hiding quite a lot from us and know much more, but not enough. Now, I want to ask you, if you don't have other questions, I'd like to mention something which people ask me a lot. Do you want me to wait for questions or go ahead?
Oh, go ahead.
I've been asked about whether the Soviets ever shot down a UFO or so-called remnants of UFO captured. I'll tell you my subjective opinion based on my research. And I want to let people know that in our books, Philip and I don't shove our conclusions down on readers in the readers' minds. We just want you to make your own conclusions. So go ahead and do further research. But my subjective opinion is that the Soviets, they were never shot anybody down. You can't shoot a technology that's far ahead of us by thousands of years. I don't want to say millions of years because we could not even relate to such an entity, but thousands of years. However, they did find things in their archaeological excavations. A space rocket-like object, which was later cut down in pieces and removed to Moscow. That was like late 1940s. And there are other confirmations of this in the book. But also, there was the case presented by Professor Budakov information, a great guy, and he's throughout the book, and his knowledge is tremendous. One of those other Russian personalities who is more larger than life, let's say, in the field of UFO research, and a scientist, one of the best Russia has. He mentioned of a case when, in early 1950s, Soviet scientists, top scientists, academicians, had been given an object to study and give their conclusions as to the nature and origin of this object, and they could not. They didn't know what it was. Well, today we know what microchips are, and that's not an issue to us. But in early 1950s they did not. But that's what they had been shown. So where did the microchip come from? And not long ago somebody told me, well, microchips are going to be outdated and gone and so forth. Fine, maybe we'll have other technologies, but at that point of time, whatever the Soviets had in their hands was a microchip. And they tried to uncover, get their scientific assessment what it was. There were other cases, and I think personally that something was uncovered in their archaeological expeditions. And why it was in the soil of Russia. It may be those objects that lie under the tundra surface of Yakutia. I mentioned them. They're mentioned in the book too. Very unusual structures that exist and are yet to be, excavated. Maybe it was something that was found among dinosaur bones. And my guide to this had been Professor Ivan Yefremov, that gentleman I mentioned in the beginning. I published an article about him, and I continue expansion. And one of my latest versions was published in UFO Matrix magazine in the first issue. And I strongly urge you, Dee, if you have a chance to read that article, because this was a personality.
I have read it. I have read it. It was good.
Thank you. And he knew something that we do not. And his knowledge was extreme. It was encyclopedic, but more than that, he knew secrets of ancient civilizations and concrete examples of miraculous technology they possessed, like in ancient China. And he knew a lot about India, but more than that, he was involved in field work. He wasn't an armchair scientist. He was involved in field work in Mongolia. And that's very important because he uncovered something in Mongolia that the Soviets, at the time, he could not even show photographs to others in the Soviet Union. He was not allowed to, but it was a gigantic being that was uncovered at great expense of physical energy and so forth in desert in Mongolia. A very unusual find. And again, I don't know what else they might have uncovered, but sometimes when people cannot express themselves in totalitarian states through free speech, they would put their ideas on paper another way. And he had a science fiction novel about an alien object discovered among dinosaur bones in Asia. It's incredible. All I can tell you is that the KGB, there was a rumor that he was a British spy, which was completely laughable and detrimental to his memory. But then they had a rumor that this gentleman was an alien. I mean, this is just one of those interesting chapters in the very mysterious history of Russian paranormal phenomena and UFO research. But it's one, if it's not a concrete example, but one of the examples of what I believe the Soviets had in their hands. They must have uncovered something. And that's very interesting. As for shoot-downs, UFO shoot-downs, they tried, like in 1953, when, again, a gigantic cylindrical object was discovered over taiga, the dense forest area of Siberia, and observed by a scientist who was a former prisoner of the concentration camps. And KGB were afraid to send their own people, so they relied on his report to an extent. And an object like that hovering over a Soviet territory, not too far away from a secret facility they had for a long time, and they decided to shoot it down, and in the process they lose a number of airplanes and people and missiles. See, all this is very interesting, and to me, it's all interconnected. And I hope that people get that feeling after they read our book.
Oh, I am, and I'm not even all the way through with it yet. I have another question from our virtual auditorium. This one's from Robotnik, who asks, how do researchers in Russia, I think it's supposed to be how do researchers in Russia go about separating the genuine UFO information and sightings from those that appear to have been generated by the state for propaganda purposes?
Let's put it this way. I don't think interstate ever did any sightings for propaganda purposes. What they had done during the Soviet times and today, they had a number of secret military tests that were, let's say, directed by one department, while the other department didn't know anything about it. And so because of that, they had interesting cases of confusion and information coming forth, like it took place in 1977 with the Petrozavodsk case. But, people had observed a launch of a satellite and then failed launch of a secret Navy missile. But at the same time, there were UFOs before and after, and sometimes even during such cases. So it's observing what we're doing. So this becomes very difficult. And yet, Russian researchers, not all, of course, but there are some who go all the way out to compare information, to discern, to take away false, because they're highly trained, like Mikhail Gerstein. I mentioned him quite a lot, or Vadim Chernobrov. They're scientists, very, very capable, very educated young men who spend their efforts and money, whatever they have, to study this, to go out in the field, to ask people, to collect information. So definitely there are mistakes, but not as many as could have been if real amateurs had studied it. Now, again, the Soviets and Russia today is a completely different case in many ways, but they never did anything for propaganda purposes. They did conduct sometimes very baneful experiments that were mistaken for UFOs. And this was one of the reasons. They didn't like that everyday people would take up UFO research, because in the process they could detect secret tests conducted by their military, which Americans would, of course, and others, and the Chinese or the British would immediately pick out, to be not UFO reports. They're not stupid. So they had secrecy involved, and UFO researchers were in their way in many ways. And of course, they would probably use them sometimes to feed out, false information to the West, but it was a very, very convoluted, complicated area. I know that CIA, based on declassified reports from the CIA, was very much interested in, Soviet UFO research and cases. And we present a number of such, information in our book. But, again, people like Mikhail Gerstein, I have nothing but greatest respect for them, because with very meager resources, they do a hell of a job of separation from, fiction from truth.
And then Moonster has come up with another question that I'd like to hear the answer to this myself. He asks, are there any cases of UFO sightings here in 2010 that is most interesting or that stand out?
In 2010 in Russia?
Yes.
There were cases a few years before. Interesting observations, but not anything. I had not seen anything really that would, except one film, but it was last year, and I don't know if it's where it was filmed, allegedly in Russia. Very eerie UFO, very unusual. So I don't want to say that there is anything earth-shattering right now in Russia, and the only case that was of real interest turned out to be, like I said, Chinese lanterns. But it doesn't mean that there are cases that we really know about, all of them. For example, USOs, we don't always find out until information leaks from the military sources.
This is one from Goddess of Fire, and she asks, have you come across any info in regards to the Hans Island and USOs?
What island?
Hans, H-A-N-S.
Where is this island? I don't.
I'm not sure either.
If it's in,
she says it's in the Arctic.
In the Arctic, is it in the Russian territory? I don't think so.
I'm waiting to see what she says. Anyway, oh gosh, that's disputed territory, she says.
Probably between. Well, that's a great question. Because there'll be many more disputes, and because of that, we'll see much more information about UFOs and USOs. Our countries are, I would say, in a race to put claim on the Arctic. Russia has its definite interest, so does Denmark, Canada, Russia, I'm sure Norway is interested, and so forth, simply because it's the time now to explore whether we want to or not, but our governments will decide that it's time now to use the natural resources of the ocean. As we need more of such resources, and oil, and more than that. They know what's going on. And although Arctic is a great area to me as a researcher of Russian UFO phenomenon, I also want to direct people's attention to the Marianas Trench, not far from the Guam territories. Very interesting area. Russians knew quite a lot about it, some information that was not presented in the West and others, because they're also all over the ocean. And more cases will come up. The Indian Ocean. And with this, I would like to mention that Pavel Popovich, that cosmonaut originally from Ukraine, one of the first Soviet cosmonauts, he passed away last year. He had an interview in 2008 with a well-known Ukrainian magazine, and he told them this. He, like his colleague Alexei Leonov, who, while he doesn't believe in UFOs, is sure about ancient astronauts having visited our planet. Please remember what I told you about excavations and findings in Russia. Okay. He, Alexei Leonov, and Pavel Popovich speak a lot about ancient civilizations and how they're sure they had visited our planet. But Popovich was more outspoken. He said that we, and I don't know who he meant by we, know of 3 bases of underwater bases of underwater civilizations, and he definitely mentioned the Indian Ocean. He mentioned the Andes, but the Andes, he said, we came to he says they found out that we came too close to finding their base, and they shut it down. So that's another base he had in mind, and I'm not sure what he meant by Andes, but it was in South America, of course, and the Indian Ocean and more. He was convinced that there are underwater civilizations. He went even further than that, and to me this is amazing. Again, this personality who had helped Soviet UFO research when it wasn't fashionable to do so, and yet nobody punished him for that. He came out and spoke about his knowledge of underwater alien civilizations on the face of our planet. When he died, he took many secrets to the grave with him. But I'm sure that much more of such information will be available as time goes by. And to me, it is truly amazing.
Speaking of the Arctic, and we have we've got 5 minutes left. You hear a lot about USOs and UFOs either under the ice or coming up through the ice or flying over the Arctic. And with all the different science stations in the Antarctic, around the South Pole, you don't hear anything. I've heard one incident from the Antarctic. And countries literally from all over the world have bases there in the Antarctic. Do you hear anything from the Russian bases that were there?
There is the Lake Vostok and a few others interesting. There are a few other interesting cases, but I don't want to say cases, but at least there is Russian presence in the Antarctica too. But to me, the most interesting case was from an island not too far away from that area, the South Georgia island that I mentioned, the British territory, and what the Soviet Navy had observed. And that's fascinating. It's not too far away from there, or the Falklands. But again, the Arctic is much more prevalent. To me, I also tie it in with the ancient Hyperborea civilization. It's like that existed, and even the Greeks knew about it, and even before them, in the regions where we have Arctic today, of people who had disappeared strangely from the face of the earth in the area over the Arctic, and much more. It's not just this century that we're, the 21st century or the 20th century that we're speaking about. It's going back sometimes thousands of years. So I'm not surprised we hear much more about the Arctic, simply because there's so much more of paranormal history in the area, and discoveries yet to be made. I got to tell you something quickly, is that the KGB in 1930s, they had a special department that was studying paranormal phenomenon. Most of the people in charge of it were, I don't want to say massacred, they were executed during Stalinist purges. There were no angels. They were, heads of the KGB at the time, but they found out quite a lot, and they had sent expeditions to the Arctic areas as well. Except we don't have all the findings. I mean, don't have most of the findings of what they had seen, but quite enough for Russian scientists in the late 1990s to go back to some of the areas and find remnants of ancient civilizations in the areas of Kola Peninsula and so forth. And someday I hope people have enough funds to really excavate and do research there without disturbing local, let's say local population and sacred sites. But there is quite a lot to study there.
Oh, interesting. We have about 2 minutes left. If you'd like to, again, let people know where they can find your books and get them ordered.
UFO Case Files of Russia can be found on heartsofatlantis.com, Amazon.com. So it's very easy to find it, and I really thank you for giving me the opportunity to express my views.
Oh, not a problem. I've seen you on several programs and kept saying, "Gosh, I'd love to get him on to talk about former Soviet Union investigations and whatnot." And then was reading this book and finding out, like you were saying, the purges. Anybody who thought outside the box, so to speak, were eliminated. It just so interesting. And I would love to have you come back on again anytime as a guest. I've thoroughly enjoyed this evening.
Thank you so much, Dee. Thank you.
It's been exciting. The book, I promise again that I will finish it. I've about 3/4 of the way through, and I'm been trying to keep from going back and reading your conclusions before finishing it, but I want to finish it first.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this evening. Thank you again, Paul, for joining us. You've been wonderful.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thanks.
Oh, and you too. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and also thank all those who joined us in the Paul Talk Virtual Auditorium. Stay tuned for Voice of the People, hosted by November Hansen. Our guest tonight is author Doug Hattaway. And please join us again next Saturday for Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis, where my guests will be Leslie King and Frank Warren. Until then, keep an eye to the sky. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Hang on.